Many of you guys already know, but I recently took part in a panel with my guys over at Fragrance Connoisseurs. My boy Charm City uh, graciously invited me to a panel discussion on niche versus clones, or so it was titled. The conversation got much deeper than that, but there were a lot of questions, a lot of great feedback. People really enjoyed the conversation. And so I thought I would react to some of the topics that we discussed and elaborate on either points that other people had made or even myself. But before we dive into all of the nitty gritty, you guys know what we do. Strap up. All right. Welcome to the Scent Bubble. I am your host for the afternoon. Okay, so let's get into it. I do apologize in advance. I'm just getting over being sick, but maybe this can be part one to a series. I'm just going to go off of the feedback to see if you guys are feeling this type of content, doing reaction videos and things like that. Because this conversation, I think it's important from the standpoint of getting information that'll help you on your fragrance journey. It can become real easy to kind of say, well, this stuff isn't important. Everybody's going to do what they want with fragrance. And I think it's kind of a yes and no to that comment, because the reality is people are going to do what they want in their fragrance journey. However, a mass majority of people in the fragrance space look to YouTube as a resource to enhance their buying experience and fragrance experience and their overall journey. And so they look to people talking about fragrance in all the nooks and crannies of conversation that could be had for that purpose. And so it's the reason all six of us got together in a discussion recently to talk about clones and niche fragrances. And so, again, with this commentary, my goal here is not to go through every single point. In fact, I don't even prioritize what stuff's most important to look at. I just took a couple of moments in this video as kind of a starter to this type of content to just elaborate on a couple of points and maybe provide some more information and perspective that could push the conversation forward, again, to help you guys have a nice resource for your fragrance journey. And before we look at a couple of these clips, I just wanted to bring up a couple of definitions real quick before we even unpack this conversation, because a lot of people define these terms differently. For the purposes of this review, I'm going to refer to a note sheet that I put together. So before we get started, for me, a niche fragrance is fragrances that are made in smaller quantities and sold in limited locations. These are not fragrance houses that are made by fashion brands and things like that. These are people that specifically are working on fragrances and fragrances only. They're not typically mass marketed through traditional channels that designer fragrances are used to being seen in. And they're typically, but not always, suggested to be of higher quality craftsmanship and offer a multi-sensory experience. For these reasons, they may be more pricey as well. There may even be an increased level of creativity, expertise, and uniqueness. This is not always definitive, though, as we will dive into this conversation, because just because that's the definition doesn't mean houses cannot cut corners on certain parameters that I have discussed. And oftentimes this can happen, which is why when you buy a niche fragrance, you cannot assume that all of these kind of bar graphs for quality that you check off in your mind are being accounted for, which is why not all niche fragrances, not all clone fragrances, and not all designer fragrances, as well as inspireds, can be trusted to have the same level of craftsmanship, etc. And that's why we have these discussions, because we find that there are often quality fragrances in the category of clone, inspired, designer, and niche, and they all don't just get a pass because they fall into a certain category or another. Now, designer fragrances are luxury fragrances made by fashion brands. They're often mass marketed via celebrities or influencers. They are mass appealing and extremely accessible. You can buy these fragrances just about anywhere. Now, clones and dupes are fragrances that seek to copy a fragrance entirely and offer it at a lower cost typically. Now, there's a lot of misconception with clones and dupes because oftentimes we look at these as if fragrances that are coming from non-designer houses. But we've seen historically that both niche and designer houses often draw from, are inspired by, or simply outright copy other DNAs, aesthetics, and marketing tactics. So that's a nuance to just be aware of. And inspirations and twists. These are fragrances that seek to copy parts of another fragrance while adding or subtracting notes to achieve something reminiscent of, but maintaining its own identity. Okay, you guys know I'm long-winded, so I tried to consolidate that for you guys. Now let's get into the bread and butter. Again, we're just going to touch on a couple of points from this video. Again, I'll link down below to the original filming of this video. I was originally going to relaunch a replay on my channel, but I want Charm City to get his proper just due. He created this concept, he gathered everybody together, and so again, another reason for the fact that I'm just going to do a very consolidated reaction video as opposed to just re-uploading the content and gathering all that viewership and all that stuff. I want him to get all his credit. So I encourage you guys to go check out that video. We are going to do a consolidated kind of part 1 to open up the conversation again. And if you guys are feeling it, let me know in the chat because I'll definitely make part 2, 3, 4, etc., touching on all the great points made in this discussion panel, so long as that it helps the fragrance community out. Okay, let's dive right in. We are going to go to my trusty split screen here, and we are going to react to one of the points that was made. We're going to watch Suits and Scents here. By the way, those of you guys who don't know who these guys are, Charm City on the top left is representing fragrance connoisseurs. He's been in this space for a long time, and he's got a lot of great perspective on fragrance. Top middle, we have Siage Saint. Top right, we have my boy Gator at the Novice Nose. Bottom left, we have Suits and Scents. In the bottom middle, we have Fat Boy Finesse, I believe. And then that bald Mr. Clean looking guy in the bottom right is yours truly. Okay, so this first clip is going to be Suits and Scents making a commentary kind of on the trustability of niche fragrances. Let's see if he makes any additional points.
Me personally, I got Original Santal over that fragrance. I was introduced to Original Santal first, so that's what I went with. Most people probably was introduced to the Mont Blanc one first, to according to price point, you know. So you go with what you can get. If it still smell the same and it still smell good, then get it. I went with Original Santal.
My favorite.
And just so you guys know, we're gonna run this. Good grief. And so what he was basically saying, and right before he dove into that, he had made the point that regardless of what fragrance he went with and the fact that there are niche and designer houses that have kind of quote unquote cloned each other, he also made the point that regardless, he trusts a niche fragrance over the clones more because he knows that the house and name come with a certain level of expertise and quality that he trusts over clones, and that he wouldn't necessarily want to go with the clone if an original was already made because the trust factor and rapport in history has already been established by the niche fragrance. And I wanted to kind of speak to that. There's just one point I wanted to make here, and that's that just because a brand has a certain level of trustability and things like that, keep in mind, guys, that if you're not familiar, if you're looking from the outside in at a particular niche fragrance house, just because they're known for quality and craftsmanship or aesthetic, all the above, doesn't always mean that you're going to get a great fragrance. And by great, I mean something that you specifically want to purchase and will have a great experience with. Niche fragrances, yes, there is a certain trustability, and that is important when buying fragrances and original fragrances. However, that doesn't get a pass to mean that every niche fragrance you buy will have that high standard of craftsmanship. And there's a lot of times where you come across niche fragrances that either smell cheap or literally cut corners when it comes to making the perfumery and still surcharge the fragrance, Or you might have a wonderfully made fragrance that you hate. That is, that no matter how good the craftsmanship and aesthetic and trustability is, it's still not for you. And it's important we make that distinction because even though it's blatantly obvious, I think sometimes the notion is that simply by being in the niche category, for instance, shopping at Neiman Marcus, that now all of a sudden you're going to go into that store and every fragrance you try is going to be incredible. That's not the case. When I've gone to Neiman's and Saks and other fragrance stores like this, and I've shopped exclusively for niche fragrances, and by the way, with my clones, it doesn't matter designer or niche. I need to say this again. I always have the original fragrance next to the clone, inspiration, designer, or whatever, because I want to see the closeness in quality and craftsmanship. However, it always starts with a fragrance that I enjoy, regardless of all those parameters. Okay. So I think it's just important to realize that as you walk through your fragrance journey, which is why you need to smell a lot of fragrances, decant a lot of fragrances, because just because the standards are high doesn't mean it's something that you will like. Do not expect to go into a Neiman's and you're often going to be shocked at how many fragrances you don't like. And I do think there's, to a certain extent, over craftsmanship where something is so complex in various categories of the perfumery that it just becomes off-putting or uncircumstantial to your wearing experience as something you would want to purchase. So again, Suits wasn't speaking against that fact, but I just kind of wanted to put forth some additional insight. Let's move forward to minute 29. And this is where I make a mention about assumptions with designers and clone fragrances. Let's go into this. The boost in or
twist, because there are perfumers, maybe not the exact ones that you know, but there are perfumers actually adding to that formula and trying to make it better, trying to make it last longer. So one misconception is that it's really just only a computer doing something. So I did find that out in my research, and I wanted to talk about that.
Can I chime in for half a second?
Come on.
I think another misconception is that when we say the word niche designer clone, because we don't have a face to put to it, we make big assumptions about the boost in or lack of quality. We were just talking about this the other day with like the perfumer for Issey Miyake, how he worked in LV. So a lot of times you have these niche perfumers in niche level houses that step into other brand names, and due to the hierarchy of where they fall, you might prejudge the fragrance's perfumer behind it because you're not looking at the perfumer, you're looking at the name and making an assumption about quality control. So that's another thing, is just that name is associated with every single fragrance down the line being better than other, or that if you're in a retail store, that somehow you're dealing with a perfumer that's more off the streets and not been a trained nose or perfumer in the space. So yeah, and also just right before you. Okay, so let's stop right there. Again, I want to reiterate here, guys. Just because you're in a particular category buying fragrance does not mean that the perfumer that made that fragrance is of a lower or higher quality in craftsmanship in terms of the perfumery itself. Oftentimes in fragrance, you have niche level perfumers that step down, air quotes, into the designer category and make designer fragrances, or vice versa. Somewhere in their career, they were working with designers and then stepped up into niche level perfumery. And oftentimes they juggle because they're contracted on a particular fragrance line or one specific fragrance. And in that case, I was talking about the perfumer from Issey Miyake moving on to LV, or vice versa. I forget in what order, but the fact that a lot of Issey Miyake fragrances mimic DNAs in the LV category, Imagination, L'Immensité, Pacific Chill, all that stuff, because it was the same perfumer. Though some people at a glance might assume that Issey Miyake fragrances are not niche level just because the name or the status or whatever. And I'll take it a step further. Even in the clone conversation, you have a lot of world-renowned perfumers that are stepping into clone house spaces with Armaf and Lattafa and Fragrance World that are now collaborating to design fragrances for these quote unquote clone houses as well. And here's the simple fact: we don't even know the perfumers that are behind a lot of the quote unquote clone and inspiration fragrances as well. So you can't really make a prejudgment as to what level of quality you're getting into. There's a lot of fragrances that from a glance look like they're terrible quality because either they're biting a design or there's not a lot of originality at the eye level of the fragrance. But then when you smell the fragrance, it's absolutely stunning. So yeah, I just wanted to make that point there, that high quality perfumers exist all and down the space, top to bottom, and that is why you can't always judge a fragrance. And also, just because you're a high-end perfumer doesn't mean you're going to make a lot of stuff that I like, and that applies from the top to the bottom as well. Before you went into this subject, I just want to say we strolled over it so fast, but it really is a big point. Just the fact that many designer fragrances and niche houses and all that stuff do clone and make inspiration fragrances, but they get an automatic pass because that was the other thing that I mentioned here. We can go ahead and pause that. And I was just making the point here that when we talk about clones and niche fragrances, we oftentimes overwrite the fact that designers and niche houses constantly clone each other. They take formulas, and it could be two scenarios. It could be a scenario where the perfumer stepped into a different market or a different space and tried to duplicate some of the same magic he made from another. Or, you have situations where other people are just simply trying to clone each other's formulas because if Dior Sauvage Elixir did amazing, let's try to get something in the same wheelhouse and put a new name on it in a new spin. And also remixes where Dior Homme Intense or Dior Homme Parfum is getting made 2, 3, 4, 5 times over with just a slight nuance simply to earn another cash grab at the market. And so, again, there I was just making the point that clones don't necessarily sit in their own category entirely because the circumstances to which the clones get made are oftentimes the same circumstances that designer and niche houses use towards each other, but they get a pass because we would never call those clones or we might call them inspirations and things like that. But as far as the mass public who doesn't know intimately these houses and these fragrances, they would simply feel a type of way as to they would make assumptions about the quality of the house in terms of their integrity, when in reality, they're all doing heavy market research to figure out what the market wants, and they're willing to cut corners even to the extent of cloning another fragrance entirely and bottling it up and giving it another name. And there's all kinds of ways that they manipulate and do this. And so it's important we acknowledge that, because clones take the rap for all of this conversation, but designer and niche fragrances before clones ever existed have been doing this since the beginning of time. So there's nothing new under the sun here. We just have a new name and a new group to put the labels on, and it's fitting for us because it makes us feel better. But we need to really have some maturity and some insight to look past this fact. Okay, so this next point I was just going to make, and it doesn't have a timestamp. Let's see. Stamp discuss the fact that this was almost a clone versus niche debate. Oh yeah. Also, this discussion ultimately was like a clone versus niche conversation, but we almost completely wrote out the designer category for this. And it's important that we should have talked about designers more in this conversation, because the reality is that niche fragrances typically cost more money, but not always. In fact, we've seen a lot of fragrance houses, Mancera being one of them, Tom Ford being another, where a lot of those niche fragrances now are being sold at typical retail level and for typical retail fragrance prices, and vice versa. There's some designer fragrances that you can find anywhere that cost upwards of $200 to $300. And so now even the price conversation isn't really a determining factor as to calling something a clone. And when you look at my earlier definition of a niche fragrance, there's even clones that fit into the niche category by definition, though we don't see them that way. So it's really interesting just to note that, like, in a lot of ways, somebody like Mancera, to me, almost feels designer, not in terms of quality, but just the simple fact that they're mass marketed, everybody knows about them or are starting to. And also, people like Tom Ford are now starting to get more into retail. And I mean, shoot, we're even seeing niche fragrances drop down to TJ Maxx level at this point. I see people in my feed constantly going to a TJ Maxx and finding Parfums de Marly, Initio. It's not a ton of fragrances, but they're still dropping down to that level for whatever reason. So that was just something I wanted to mention. We're going to go through a couple of other quick ones since we've already hit the 20-minute mark, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. I may even cut it short. Let's speed up to 1 minute and 4. And Charm mentions the cost of fragrance being less. Okay, this is a good one. So 104. Okay.
We talked about, I had you on the live when I did it, when I talked about the cost of a fragrance and how that fragrance is. One thing I will say before I ask who's part of it is, even in a car, the actual cost of a car is so much less than the actual sale price of a car. What they put in and the cost for them to make it is so much less. And there are different things that are being involved. It goes through the original parts makers, then it goes to the distributor that sells actually to the actual manufacturer, and then the manufacturer has to put their markup for putting the assembly together. Then it goes to the actual retail sales store, and they have to pay for their shop, they have to pay for their salesmen and everything like that. And all of that is getting added into the car. And in the fragrances, it's a lot of the same thing. But it is kind of crazy just to think in and of itself that the actual juice in that fragrance is anywhere from $1 to $3 for a fragrance that costs $200 to $300.
I thought this was, man, an incredible point. And we did spend some time on it, but we should have spent more time on it. Guys, listen to what he just said. This is so true. Inspiration, clone, designer, and niche. No matter what we're talking, even though there are certain fragrances that are made with higher end ingredients or harder to find ingredients and things like that, the reality is that no matter what fragrance you have, it may never cost more than $10 to actually manufacture the juice. That's insane when you consider that fragrances cost anywhere from $20, $30 to thousands of dollars. The margin at every level can be insane. Even at the lower end clone level, there's still such high margins to be made that it's profitable on all fronts. This is an incredible point, because even in niche perfumery, the quality and the standards that we esteem to be so high are coming from juices that cost less than $10 to make. So at that point, again, there's surcharges beyond that, right? The craftsmanship, the manufacturing, the distribution, all those things that he mentioned. But nonetheless, again, the margins are so high that oftentimes with higher end name brands or even independent, newer known niche houses, they are surcharging on a lot of invisible parameters that we know nothing about. And if you knew that a lot of your niche fragrances costed less than $10 to make, and maybe when it was all said and done, less than $100 to do the horse and pony dance to get it out to the shelves or whatever, you would feel some type of way about the fact that you're still spending hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on these fragrances, or at least you should. I know I would. So I just thought this was an incredible point to make, that, guys, if you think for a second that some of these niche fragrances are costing like $100 to put together from a juice standpoint, and that's why you're having to spend $300, $400, $500 on your angel share or something like that, you're out of your mind. These juices are still, relatively speaking, really cheap to make. And when you have a well-known niche house who has relationships with manufacturers and people overseas and things like that, and they have a system that's tried and true, oftentimes they're always trying to get that cost insanely low so that their profits are insanely high. And that's important for you to know, because at the end of the day, this is why you can have clone fragrances that are better than niche fragrances or meet them at the same level. And for that reason, it introduces a whole different type of consumer that can get similar levels, same levels, or sometimes better levels of experience than their cloned counterpart or whatever. So I thought this was just an incredible point made by Charm. I know he was just trying to provide perspective in this situation, but it actually was one of the most profound points to the whole discussion. Okay, guys, with that being said, let's zoom out for a second. Again, thank you guys so much for tapping in. Do you guys think that these reaction videos are necessary? Again, I'm not just trying to make content. I'm trying to make valuable content for consumers that are out there thinking through purchasing fragrance and trying to enhance their fragrance experience due to what they know. I'm trying to heighten your senses as a buyer, as a wearer, as somebody who interacts with other people with fragrance and goes out in the world and wears the fragrance. Was this helpful for you in your fragrance journey in terms of helping your purchasing, or even just enlightening you on some things that you weren't aware of? Let me know in the comments below for sure. I'd like to hear your guys' feedback, and if you'd like me to continue to make some comments and reactions to these videos. And I would even like to go react to certain videos that I wasn't necessarily on a part of the panel for. I know Charm, due to the feedback he got from this video, he's gone on to do more elaborations and different perspectives on this topic, which I'm excited to see. I'm all here for it, and I love the perspective. And I'm even excited to see some of the kind of clashing and controversial topics that we can digest and break down so that we can just, again, this is hobby stuff for us, guys. At the end of the day, hopefully you guys are all mature enough to extract the value at a level that works for you in your fragrance journey. Okay, guys, that's enough for me. I'm feeling a little bit winded. Again, I'm getting over being sick here, but sound off in the comments. I do talk back, and this was a reaction. Again, I'm going to post the original video in the comments below. It was a 2 hour and 36-minute video, so definitely go show Charm some love. Throw it on in the car and listen through it, and let me know what you think. So many people hit me up after this panel discussion, which was awesome. It definitely struck a chord in many positive ways than negative. So again, this is the Scent Bubble. I hope you guys have a blessed week, and signing off. Be blessed.